Our next speaker is from the University of Maryland, Professor Samuel Kersten. He is the chair of the Department of Sociology and the Department of Philosophy. Sorry, I'm stuck in my discipline. I apologize. Talk about ethnocentrism. Anyway, Professor of Philosophy, chair of the Philosophy Department, who works on bioethics, ethical theory, and Kant. He is author of Kant's Search for Supreme Principles of Morality, published by Cambridge Press, and How to Treat Persons, published by Oxford in 2013, as well as articles on the subject of just distribution of scarce, life-saving resources, the ethics of procreation, and the morality of markets in organs. Please welcome Professor Kirsten, who will be speaking about treating others merely as means.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very grateful. I'm happy to be here. Can you hear me in the room? Yeah? Okay. So I thought my talk needed some dignity, so I put dignity into the title. So the title is Dignity in Treating Others Merely as Means. Dignity appears, I believe, 5 times in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The preamble begins, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, and goes on from there. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, however, leaves the concept of dignity undefined. It leaves it vague. Nevertheless, the concept seems important. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights suggests that the human rights set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. So where do we get these rights from? From the inherent dignity of the human person, or so this document suggests. To see whether persons having dignity entails that they have human rights, it would be necessary to have a determinate notion of dignity. One of my projects is to develop a notion of the dignity of persons that's inspired by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804 and is still quite influential. Here's what I hope to accomplish today. I want to set out and illustrate with some concrete examples this Kant-inspired notion of the dignity of persons. Let me be clear on a few points. First, according to the notion, respecting the dignity of persons involves refraining from treating them merely as means. So the title I originally gave wasn't completely off the mark. Look, the second you make a notion of dignity determinate, you invite controversy. soon as you specify what you mean by dignity, some people are not going to be pleased with what the implications of what you said are. So I think it's going to become apparent that my specification of the notion has substantive and controversial implications. It could be that dignity isn't defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, partly because people wanted to come together and agree on the document. Perhaps if specifications of the notion were offered, arriving at agreement would have been a lot more difficult. Because of time constraints, I'm not going to be able to explore the extent to which embracing the idea that persons possess dignity as I specify it would entail embracing the idea that persons have particular human rights. I just don't have time to get into that. I'm going to try to sketch for you a specific account of dignity and show you what some of its implications might be. So, what I'm going to engage in is an exercise in normative ethics, and it's going to start out rather abstract. I'm going to set forth my account, explain it, and then apply it. And I am reasonably confident that once I start applying it, its content will become clearer than it might be immediately. So what I'm saying is, what I'm going to present right now is a bit abstract, but it will be illustrated concretely more and more as the talk goes on. So on my Kantian account, dignity is a special status possessed by persons. I don't have time to get into my particular account of persons, but let me just say that on this account, for example, embryos don't count as persons, and neither do individuals in a permanent vegetative state. So dignity is a special status possessed by persons. This status is such that, one, a person ought not to use another merely as a means. And this first aspect of person's special status is lexically prior to the following aspect. So in order not to run afoul of this account of dignity, you got to first make sure you're not treating another merely as a means. And only then can you turn to abiding by the other parts of it. So, two, if a person treats another in some way, then she ought to treat him as having unconditional, preeminent value. An agent's treatment of a person respects the dignity of that person only if it accords with the special status just described. I'm going to explain this account, but first, some important points. This account, which I call RWP, Respect for the Worth of Persons, is what it stands for, is not a complete account of respect for the dignity of persons. I don't offer what I take to be jointly sufficient conditions for one person's respecting the dignity of another. So I don't pretend it's a complete account. Secondly, and this is an important departure from Kant, on my view, failure to respect the dignity of persons is always wrong pro tanto, but sometimes not wrong all things considered. So what I mean by that is this. Each of us always has significant moral reasons to respect the dignity of persons, but in certain contexts, those reasons can be overridden. So a quick example, suppose that the only way that I can save the lives of millions of people is to treat one person merely as a means. On my account, it's the case that I have failed to respect the dignity of the individual whom I've treated merely as a means. Nevertheless, what I do may well be, all things considered, morally permissible. That is not the kind of view that Immanuel Kant held. All right, so let me focus on the notion of persons treating another merely as a means. Suppose an agent uses another. She uses him merely as a means on my account if it is reasonable for her to believe that he's unable to consent to her using him and he cannot share the proximate end she is pursuing in using him. Notice that what I presented is a sufficient condition for one person treating another merely as a means. I'd like to say right away that people use one another all the time. When I got a coffee from the cafe, I used the server's skills at making espresso. Our students use us to get grades and degrees. There's nothing wrong very often with using another person, and nothing in this account implies that there's something wrong typically with a person using another. What this account is an account of is one individual treating another merely as a means, or equivalently in English, at least roughly speaking, just using another. So in order to understand this account of treating another merely as a means, we've got to start with what it means to use another person. That might seem to be something that it's quite easy to define. Let me assure you, it's not that easy to define. Here's an attempt. An agent uses another just in case she intentionally does something to or with some aspect of the other to realize her end, and she intends the presence or participation of some aspect of the other to contribute to the end's realization. Now, what's important for our purposes here is that there's a distinction between using another and treating the other in some way. So suppose I'm a police officer and I'm chasing after a suspect, and someone gets in my way, and I push that person aside. In that case, I've treated the person I pushed aside in some way, but I haven't used that person on this account of one individual using another. The presence or participation of that, say, civilian who got in my way wasn't something that I intended to contribute to my end's realization, which would be to capture the person I'm going after. From the perspective of my purposes, it would have served better had the person who got in my way not been there at all. So another important aspect of this account of treating others merely as a means is the notion of an inability to consent. On my account, a person is unable to consent to an agent's using him if he can't avert this use simply by withholding his agreement to it. Note that what's at issue here isn't actual consent. It's not hypothetical consent. It's a possibility of consent defined in a particular way. And I'll illustrate that soon. Another key concept in this account is that of an inability to share an end. So a person is unable to share an end an agent is pursuing and using him, roughly if the person has an end such that his pursuing it at the same time he willed the agent's end would be practically irrational. By practically irrational here, I don't mean almost irrational, I mean irrational in a practical sense. Okay, so this notion invokes some abstract concepts, but I put to you that it's not that tough to illustrate concretely. So suppose someone uses another by enslaving the person. Okay? I put to you that the enslaver would be treating the person he enslaves merely as a means, according to this account. Why? Well, because the person being enslaved, first off, can't avert the use the other wants to make of him simply by dissenting to it. The person being enslaved, a plausible account of what's going on, can't just say, excuse me, I'd rather that you not enslave me, and thus have the person trying to enslave cease and desist. Secondly, it's reasonable for the enslaver to believe that the person he's enslaving can't share his end. Why can't he share his end? Well, because the person's willing the enslaver's end, namely that he be enslaved, would preclude him from realizing a bunch of ends that he has, such as the end to get home to his family. So this is a clear illustration, I think, of a case of someone treating another merely as a means that's captured by this particular account. So let's turn to the second tier of this Kantian notion of respect for the worth of persons. If a person treats another in some way, then she ought to treat him as having unconditional preeminent worth. What do I mean by an individual as having unconditional worth? Well, if an individual has such worth, then it has positive value in any and all circumstances in which it exists. And this value doesn't vary on the basis of its intelligence or talents, its instrumental value to others, or the degree of its health, or personal satisfaction, or well-being. And I might add, in the context of the previous lecture, if a being has unconditional worth, that worth doesn't diminish on the basis of his having done odious things. Now, suppose that a being with unconditional worth also has preeminent worth. Well, for one thing, that means that no amount of anything that is not a being of that kind can have a value equal to or greater than a being of that kind. So if persons have preeminent worth, then a person has a worth that is greater than any number of beings that fail to have such worth, and maybe lobsters or fish would be an example. All right, so I promised that I would try to apply this account that I've developed and that it would become clear in the application. So here goes. Let's take a group of people with cystic fibrosis. For those of you who might not know, cystic fibrosis is a condition, genetic condition that results in severe breathing problems, digestive problems. Until the past several decades, people with it very often typically didn't live past 25 or 30. Now life expectancy has gone up, but it's still a serious condition. Okay, so a group of people with cystic fibrosis give their informed consent to investigators to have their blood used in a study of the effectiveness of drugs to prevent lung infections. This is not a crazy counterfactual here, okay? After the investigators anonymize the blood samples, they take the name of the person off of it, the address, that kind of thing. They provide them to an outside researcher who, without the donor's knowledge or consent, uses them to study a method to determine whether early-stage fetuses carry mutations for cystic fibrosis. Now, according to the law in the United States right now, none of the researchers act in violation of federal regulations, even as those regulations have been recently updated. But the outside researcher seems to be violating this account of respect for the dignity of persons that I've proffered. He seems to be treating some of the donors of the blood samples merely as means and thus acting pro tanto wrongly. Why? Well, because it's reasonable for him to believe that some of the donors can neither consent to his use of him nor share the end he's pursuing in using them. Why can't they consent? Well, because they never had an opportunity to preclude his, or by his I mean the people working on early identification of CF fetuses, they never had the opportunity to preclude that particular use of them. Moreover, it's reasonable for the investigator to believe that some of these people who gave blood samples can't share the investigator's end. Why not? Because they might be against the abortion of fetuses that are found to have cystic fibrosis. That's not a big leap to think this. So I think that some of you, in looking at this example, might say, yeah, maybe there is something wrong with the way that medical research is conducted in this country. Others might think, no, that's not a plausible implication of your view. Part of my point is that as soon as you start specifying what a notion of dignity amounts to, you get results that not everyone is going to agree with. I personally think that this is a very plausible result. I mean, this is something I'm happy to stand by. So, we can ask whether federal rules are morally misguided, and our specification of a notion of dignity allows us to articulate what might be a moral problem with those regulations. All right, let me do another application. Let me see how I'm doing on time. It's an application to the realm of physician-assisted dying. So a young athlete suffers a spinal cord injury that renders him nearly paralyzed from the neck down. He judges that his decades of future life would be miserable. Deemed competent by psychiatrists, he repeatedly makes an informed, voluntary request to a doctor for a lethal injection. So, in effect, to avoid future suffering, he makes an autonomous choice to die. There are cases very much like this that have arisen. Now, in giving this young man a lethal injection, a doctor would be respecting his autonomous choice. But would the doctor's action be right? She would be facilitating his autonomous pursuit of what he takes to be good for him. That's clear just from the description of the example. But she would be failing to respect his dignity according to RWP. Now, why is that? Well, it's because there is a distinction between an individual's pursuit of what he takes to be good for him and, roughly speaking, the worth in the individual. No matter what a person thinks of him or herself, a person might think that his future life would just not be worth living. It might be the case, according to this Kantian framework that I developed, that he's wrong, that he nevertheless has special inherent worth. And in this case, look, if the physician gives this person a lethal injection, getting specifically back to the account I presented, she is not treating him as having unconditional preeminent worth. She's treating him as if his worth has diminished significantly as a result of his being a quadriplegic. And according to the Kantian account, which puts forth the view that the worth of persons attaches to their having certain capacities, his worth has not diminished at all. So again, this is an example that I am happy to defend and will defend, but I understand fully, and I've heard from a lot of people who disagree vehemently with this. And okay, but again, once we start specifying what we mean by dignity, we're going to end up with results where not everyone is on board. Okay, let me just say one final thing, and that is someone might make the following objection to this account that I've put forth. Someone might say, this sort of Kantian prescription to respect the dignity of persons would implausibly condemn the withholding of life-sustaining treatment from a patient who competently requests that it be withheld. And, a lot of people find that implication incredibly implausible. There's a view that has widespread adherence according to which people have a moral right to refuse treatment. If I don't want to be put on a respirator, then I have a moral right. We're not talking about the law. I have a moral right to refuse to be put on it. You also in this country have a legal right not to be put on it, by the way. You might think that this account of the dignity of persons I presented would have the implication that a physician would be acting wrongly if she didn't force a person onto a respirator who would otherwise die and keep his faculties intact if he were on it. But I would say that my account doesn't have this implication. So let's suppose specifically that the young athlete will die if not put on a respirator, but has competently refused one. I think that if a doctor forces him onto the machine, she treats him merely as a means and thereby fails to respect his dignity. Why does she treat him merely as a means? Well, because she uses him on my account of using. His presence and participation is key to her getting her goal, which is presumably to preserve his life. If he's not there, she can't preserve his life. Moreover, she, in forcing him on the respirator, doesn't allow him the possibility of dissenting from her use of him and thus precluding the action taking place. And finally, she reasonably believes that he cannot share her end of his maintaining life because he thinks his life is not worth living. So this account that I put forth doesn't have one unfortunate implication that you might suspect that it would. Okay, thank you very much.
Questions? Thank you for that presentation. Very interesting. Yes. Yes. Let me give you mine.
So I read Kant's groundwork some years ago, and I thought I perceived a definition of dignity that was not quite as granular as this one, and there's a section in the groundwork. It's more of an instantiation than a definition, where he suggests that dignity is located in those values and incidents that are beyond valuation in the marketplace. And I just, kind of pose that because as a kind of simpler alternative to the kind of granular analysis you've presented. Could I ask you to compare that discussion in the groundwork, if I've got it right in the way that you might agree with it, with what you've presented? Is a way of looking at dignity in Kant's eyes one that takes into account the potential dehumanizing elements of the marketplace, but also identifies dignity as those things that are beyond the realm of the marketplace?
Right, so thanks for the question. I say in this account that if you treat another in some way, then you should treat the person as having unconditional and preeminent worth. And what I think is that the notion of preeminence captures all that's worth capturing in Kant's notion of a value beyond price. So that's why one of the reasons I don't mention value beyond price. There are several very problematic aspects of Kant's own view, in my opinion. Let me just give you one. On one plausible interpretation, he actually says that persons have unconditional and incomparable value. And that seems to mean that it would never be legitimate to exchange the existence of one person for 50 or 50 million other persons. So if you were in a situation where you had to choose between saving one or saving 50,000, what you would have to do, since the worth of persons is incomparable, is flip a coin. And that is not a result that I'm comfortable with.
Yes, over here.
I am in need of examples from some other sphere. So an important part of the human rights project is social and economic rights. One can roughly translate that into a struggle against poverty. Mm-hmm. So how would your account be exemplified in the sphere of poverty and the struggle against poverty?
So let me just make one quick point and then a longer one. The quick point is that nowhere today or in any of my work do I claim that this account captures the whole of morality or ethics. Okay, so I'm a pluralist in this regard. I don't think that Immanuel Kant has the truth here. Secondly, I think that the second tier of my account, the idea that if you treat someone in some way, then you ought to treat the person as having an unconditional preeminent worth, would have very serious implications for our treatment of the poor. If you hold persons to have the kind of worth I was just talking about, it would occur to you very quickly that it would be a really good thing to keep them in existence. They have such special worth. Just think of other things that you think of as having a special worth, like a 17th century violin or something. One of the things that people do with these sorts of things is try to keep them in being, protect them, that sort of thing. So it would follow that starvation would be really bad. Another thing that I think would follow is that you would want to make it possible for them to exercise the capacities that you value so highly. What is supposed to have unconditional preeminent worth? Rational nature. And rational nature, although I couldn't get into it in this talk, stands for a set of capacities, including the capacity to set and pursue rationally various ends. So if you really valued rational nature as having this special worth, you would want to promote people's ability to set and pursue ends.
Michael, did you have a question?
I did. It's not well formed, but one way to think perhaps about this Kantian notion is to think of it as directing us to think in terms of principle as we apply law, right? So that's how the human rights community has thought of this principle. So when you think about something as a principle, you cannot fix it in the same way that you would apply a law. So, for example, if you play chess, a law is that you cannot put your king in jeopardy knowingly. But a principle is that you should try not to lose your queen. So you can lose your queen, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that principles articulate a kind of a framework within which to think, but can never be pinned down to a specific set of actions. As soon as you try to pin a principle down to a specific set of actions, you lose its ability to impart the capacity to think wisely in difficult situations. Am I making sense to you?
I think so. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Look, there's a view in philosophy that's referred to as moral particularism. And in one version, it just says something like, you Kantians and you consequentialists of various stripes with your principles, they don't really help us when we're making real ethical choices in the world. Well, in order to make such choices, we just have to take account of all of the fine-grained circumstances that we find on the ground. I'm not a moral particularist, and I really think that, number one, having principles like this account of respect for dignity is genuinely action guiding. And I also think that in some circumstances, the implications of the view are really clear. I mean, it doesn't take much thought at all to come to the conclusion that torturing a toddler for fun would be a failure to respect the toddler's dignity as a person.
Over here. Jeez.
Thank you for your very clear presentation. I appreciated that, and at the end how you had the application, to help us think about the ideas you presented was very helpful. I'm wondering if you've heard of the book Agent-Centered Morality? Harris. He writes about Kantian internalism, and your point about the Kant's idea of rationalism as what is a rational means of pursuit, or what is, I think this is getting back to the point here about the ultimate end of life. How do we decide what the good is? What Aristotle and Plato were speaking about? Is there a political science, an architectonic political science of the good to rule all the crafts and technes? Is there an ultimate way that we know what is good? Perhaps this person dying is good because he's going into another world and it's the right progression for his soul. You know what I'm saying? And that's even on a spiritual level. Even on practical levels of what is good biologically in terms of human flourishing, we're quite limited. In Harris's book, Agent-Centered Morality, he says the problem is that Kant's notion is not grounded, he's using the word agent, but really he's talking about the subject, in a process of value integration. So therefore, there's a kind of inherent asymmetry to it, or assumption to it, about what is the dominant or universal good. And in a true dialectical approach, or worldview, comprehensive approach, the values, they're being consistently, regulated by one another in dialogue. So a good, he has goods of love, goods of respect, and goods of engagement, which include like aesthetic pleasure. And he says all three of these need to be one another. As a partial good, the person's life needs to be regulated by an impartial. I'm wondering if you've heard of this account and if you've thought of these kinds of questions, because it seems to me this is a real kind of divide in the way that it's approached by philosophers. And I'm wondering what your take on these kinds of questions or challenges to Kant are, similar to Harris's.
So let me just say, thanks. One of the reasons why I'm not well received in some parts of the Kantian community is because I just don't think that this one theory, Immanuel Kant's theory, captures all that's important in the ethical realm. So I made a point of saying that I've just offered a partial account of respect for the dignity of persons. I also said that I'm a pluralist in moral affairs. I think that sometimes failing to respect the dignity of a person can be morally permissible, all things considered. So, I'm open to, I think, the kind of thing that you're saying Harris needs to be considered.
I'm going to stop there because it's time for our lunch break. We'll have an hour. It must be this one. We have an hour for lunch, and we'll come back here at 1:30 and resume. And there'll be 2 other speakers this afternoon and the round table. So I really encourage you to please come back at 1:30. We'll start promptly. Thank you.